So I'm going to talk today about, as Dave said, the text encoding initiative. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the text encoding initiative. I won't be teaching you how to do it, as you'll be relieved perhaps to hear, but I'm going to talk about what it is, how it works, why you might want to use it in your own research. And along the way, I'm going to be doing two things. I'm going to be showing you some examples, so some projects which you have used the text encoding initiative for various different things. But I'm also going to be trying to place the text encoding initiative in a slightly broader context of digital humanities. I suppose the text encoding initiative is what you'd call a mature part of the digital humanities. It's been around for quite a long time. So that's one thing, the idea of TEI as being a mature digital humanities. I'm not sure if you would call it a tool or a technology or a language, which has had a kind of broader effect in a way on the digital humanities. But I'm also going to talk about TEI not just as an encoding language, but also as a digital humanities phenomenon, a body of scholars, and a kind of a way of looking at digital humanities. Right. So when we think about the text encoding initiative, you might have heard of the text encoding initiative in the context of being an XML standard, or a standard usually expressed in XML, for doing textual research in digital humanities. You might have heard about it in the context of being a metadata standard used by cultural heritage institutions. And both of those things are partly true. But I think one thing that it's important to remember about text encoding initiative is that at heart, the TEI is a consortium which does a number of things, and its chief deliverable is delivering a set of guidelines for encoding methods for machine readable texts. But that's only one of the things it does. And I'm just going to start with giving some context about the broader work of the text encoding initiative and its role in digital humanities. I mean, so it hosts a conference, it publishes a journal, it runs a whole host of special interest groups, it provides mechanisms to suggest additions and amendments to the text encoding initiative guidelines, maintains a suite of open tools and services. But I think more important than any of that is that it acts as a hub for a community of digital humanities practitioners engaged in textual scholarship. So at heart, in a sense, the text encoding initiative is a community of researchers. And one of the most interesting things I think about the text encoding initiative is that its chief deliverable, so the guidelines for machine readable texts, are in a sense a reflection of the activities of that community of digital humanities scholars. So when I came on the TEI summer school 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, one of the people leading it was James Cummings, who's now at Newcastle. He's written a very interesting article called A World of Difference. There's a link to it there, Myths and Misconceptions about the TEI. And to paraphrase some of the things he says, I mean, he says that the role, essentially, that this idea that the role of the scholarship in the formation of TEI is one of the most interesting things about it. And I would, in a sense, go further and say that the TEI guidelines would be a good place to start, kind of, if you were doing historiographical study of text-based digital humanities activities. And I think the kind of historiography of digital humanities as digital humanities matures is perhaps a kind of gap, which or an area where there's some interesting work to be done. And if we look at the contents page of the TEI guidelines, and here you can see in the middle, you can see, in a sense, just looking at the modules in TEI, it reflects the kinds of things which have been done with it. And this is certainly by no means a closed list, so TEI grows through use. So as TEI is used for new things, so the TEI expands. So you can expect that list to grow as as the community engages in new activities. But to get down to more practical matters, so the TEI is a standard method for the consistent semantic markup of text. So that's adding meaning to textual documents. And the main two reasons why this is done is, first of all, for the display of textual content. So most often now to the web, but also to print, and for the analysis of textual content. So the analysis of textual content using digital humanities methods and tools. And to fulfill these two main aims of the TEI, it concentrates on two areas. So the first is on the description of source documents. So what we often think about as metadata, data about the data itself, and, well, transcription or encoding of that source document itself. And when we think about what the source documents might be, they're essentially anything with a textual content. So we might think of plays, we might think of poems, we might think of letters, inscriptions, records, official records, transcriptions of spoken word, of speech, proceedings, etc. So it's really a very broad set of material which TEI is engaged with. And it's worth saying at the start that TEI operates in a sense across a single text, but also many TEI using projects are interested in textual corpora. So in looking at many different texts at the same time, and that will come through when I talk about specific project examples. Just as a kind of slight tangent, just to talk about what I mean by semantic markup. So one of the most common markup languages, which many people are familiar with, HTML. So this is me saying, I recently read the whole TEI guidelines and enjoyed it very much. I'm not sure if I would enjoy that experience. But here's TEI guidelines is marked up with the I tag in HTML. That means that it should be in italics. And that indicates, in a sense, that it is a title of sorts, but you're just there. HTML is concerned with how things display. If you did the same thing in TEI, you would say what it was. So you would semantically mark up the concept of TEI guidelines with concept of title. So you then might decide that you wanted all title tags to display in italics, but that's a slightly different thing. TEI is concerned with saying what things are in textual documents, not so much concerned necessarily with how they display. And to talk about what we mean when we talk about a standard within XML, it should be pointed out that TEI is closely tied to XML, but it's not totally forever tied to XML. It's currently most often expressed in XML, but for our purposes, let's think about it as an XML standard. So XML really doesn't care what you call things. So this is something I feel it is great to be here virtually, but I do wish we were all in Oxford on this lovely sunny day. At least it's sunny here in Cambridge. Now here I've marked up the word Oxford with the tag lampshade, and that's completely fine as far as XML is concerned. I could call Oxford a cat. I could call it, I don't know, any number of things, and XML wouldn't mind. TEI does care what you call things. So TEI provides you with a vocabulary most commonly expressed in XML, which does care what you call things and will say that Oxford should be called a place name. And that all TEI projects who are marking up pieces of text containing place names should, broadly speaking, use place name to mark them up, and that is significant, as I'm sure you will be able to imagine in a number of ways. So to go into more detail, as I said, TEI is most commonly expressed in XML. The way markup is used in TEI is strongly tied to research interests. So the research interests of the project. And particularly coming from a library background, when one thinks of metadata standards like MARC or encoded archival description for archives, there's a sense there that if 20 different librarians encoded the same book in MARC, that broadly speaking, they should all be encoding it the same way. So the standard not only tells you how to mark things up, but also tells you, in a sense, what should be marked up. TEI isn't like that. TEI provides a vocabulary for markup, but the markup used in each project is tied to your particular interest, your research interest or your purpose. These two sets of interests, I mean, research interest is a bit narrow, maybe general interests are, as I said, for display, so to the web, sometimes in multiple forms. We'll see that in a moment, and in print, but also to analysis. So when we look at TEI using projects and the world of digital humanities, the kinds of things which are often applied to corpora of TEI documents or TEI data sets are things like network analysis, particularly in correspondence, natural language processing, quantitative code ecology, etc. And one of the interesting things about TEI, I think, as a digital humanities, as a thing in the digital humanities, is it then allows you, if you think about running analyses on a TEI data set, it allows you to record the results of those analyses back into the data set to form the basis of further research. So TEI, in a sense, allows you to engage in an iterative process of research around a single data set, which I think is an interesting model for the digital humanities. So in practical terms, I mean, people very often when they come to the TEI, they have a look at the guidelines and they realize quickly that the TEI guidelines are very large. And when you look at them for the first time, it's quite difficult to imagine how you might get started with TEI. Researchers will usually use just a small subset of the guidelines which relate to the particular research questions they have about the text or set of texts that they're working on. And when they're making the decisions about what parts of the TEI to use, I suppose two questions which they will address is what they want to say about those texts for display or analysis, and then which elements of the text itself do they want to encode for display or analysis. So the first point relates to, I suppose, the metadata about the text, so things, assertions you want to make about the text, which either are implicit or explicit in the text, so drawing out things like names, places, dates into a kind of metadata structure, a descriptive structure, and then within the text itself, which parts of the text do you want to actually encode for your research purposes. So just to go through an example, here is a letter, a textual document. It's a letter from me to my mother, talking about a day I had in Cambridge. I was saying to one of the other conveners, I wrote this letter, it's not a real letter. I wrote this letter yesterday for the purposes of having a textual document to examine. I don't think I've written anything by hand since the start of lockdown, so it was really difficult. I'd kind of forgotten how to write, so not all of the mistakes in this letter are deliberate. I just wanted to look at taking this document and looking at two ways of encoding it in TEI, both of which are completely valid but are completely different. So if we take the text of that letter, I don't want you to worry too much about understanding everything here in terms of the TEI. As I said, it's not my purpose here to teach you how to do TEI. But just to explain that here is that letter marked up as you would mark it up for an edition. So a print edition or an edition on the web, which would in some senses record some semantic information about the way the text had been written. So you can see here that Fitz has been expanded with William, that's Fitzwilliam Museum, so things like expansions and abbreviations. It's got some structure, it's paragraph tags. It has got something about the way things look. So here I've marked this up to display in italics, and it's got things like additions and where they occur and what position they're in. So that's one completely valid approach to this text in TEI. This is exactly the same text, also completely valid TEI, which is marked up in a completely different way. So here we've taken a much more semantic approach to the markup. So place names have been marked up as place names. Organizations have been marked up as organizations. People have been marked up as people. Date has been marked up with a date, and it's been given a machine readable format. So again, two completely different approaches, two completely different purposes. So just to take the second as an example, I mean, that's just a single letter which isn't of very much interest. But if you took, say, that principle and applied it to the corpus of letters of someone like Charles Darwin, then you might be able to start thinking about the people Darwin was writing to, when he was writing to them, where he was going, what he was reading. And across a corpus of letters, you might start to be able to take automated approaches to give you new knowledge about Darwin and his network. You could also decide that you were interested, particularly in the case of Darwin, in things I haven't marked up. So there are two mentions of plants here, rose, runner beans. Darwin was a great collector of plants in the early parts of his career, so you could think about, am I interested, say, in the Darwin corpus, in marking up plants and when they were collected, and perhaps relating that to other collections like herbarium collections. The second thing to really say about the practical use of TEI is that TEI both has the guidelines themselves which you can read, but it also supports a schema, which is a machine-readable version of the guidelines. Now, each TEI document includes a reference to the schema, and in practice, most projects use cut-down versions of the TEI schema, which only contain the parts of the TEI relevant to their purposes. So what we get, in a sense, is as a result, is TEI documents where texts are described and encoded in ways which closely relate to the research questions and use cases of those creating them, and that relation between encoding and research is controlled by a schema. So it's controlled kind of automatically. And XML editors will use that schema to enforce the TEI guidelines in the document and to help you create valid TEI. So here is that same TEI document in a XML editor. This is the Oxygen XML editor, and you can see here that I've used, again, the tag lampshade. Let's put a red line underneath it. There's an angry red square, as it's called, at the top, saying this is not valid TEI. At the bottom, it tells you the element lampshade is not allowed anywhere, so it's controlling. It's making sure that my TEI relates to what I'm trying to do. And if I then take out the lampshade tag and start to think about what elements I might put around whether, then the editor again will read the machine-readable version of the guidelines and start prompting me. So that's just to say that in practice, when one's using TEI, which can seem like vast and complicated and difficult to navigate when you look at the guidelines, actually what the practical experience of using TEI is you get a lot of prompting and feedback through this idea of a machine-readable schema. Okay, I'll just have a look at the time. So I'm going to take you through three different TEI using projects. I'm going to talk a bit about the background, the projects, what they're trying to achieve. For each one, I'm going to hopefully, if I can manage to navigate it, show you a piece of the TEI that they use to point out that this idea that TEI does operate in a sense as a standard, but that the way TEI is used by different projects relates to their research questions. And then I'm going to show you that, I suppose, what you think about the outputs of the projects to show, and that this is really thinking about TEI as a data set having the capacity to do more than one thing. So to produce more than one different kind of output from the same data set. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Darwin Correspondence project, which is actually this project which is within the university library building. It's an embedded research project in the library, partly because the vast majority of Darwin's correspondence exists as a collection within the library. So I suppose one of the interesting things about the Darwin Correspondence project is its longevity. So it's a very long running project to transcribe, edit and publish the complete correspondence of Charles Darwin. And it started in 1974, and I think it finishes in 1 or 2 years, because they're doing a year of Darwin's life every year and publishing a volume. And eventually, of course, you run out of years of Darwin's life. So kind of sadly, in a sense, that this project, which has been going on for so long, is limited by the lifespan of the person they're studying, which is kind of doubly sad in a strange way. So the Darwin Correspondence project, again, I mean, if you looked at all of the different ways they've handled their data through the course of the project, I think they're actually thinking about publishing on this, on all the different approaches they've taken to data since 1974, all the different purposes they've had, the way that in a sense, Digital Humanities has changed under the feet of the project as time has gone by and affected the way that they've done things. I think that in itself would be a very interesting study. But they finally came to adopt TEI as their metadata standard in 2015, and they have about approximately 15,000 TEI records, each of which represents a letter, either to Darwin or from Darwin. And I'm going to try and take a look at one of their TEI records. Bear with me for a moment. Okay. One bigger again. So there's a lot of encoding here and a lot of tags. So I'm not going to try and explain the whole thing, but I just want to pick out 2 particular areas. So the top part of the TEI record, as I said, is the TEI header is, broadly speaking, what we might think of as a metadata area. Now, one of the main interests in correspondence in digital humanities is to do with network analysis. I just want to focus in on this small section here, this Correspondence part of TEI, and the information that's recorded here. So here, all of this information also exists further down in the transcription, which I'll show you in a minute. But here, the project's picked out, essentially, who sent the letter, from where, when it was sent with a machine-readable format, and then has a second action, received, and says who received the letter, and often it will also include the place and the date where it was received, if that's recorded. If we go further down, you'll see that the TEI document also contains a transcription of the letter, which contains all of that information, but in a way which is slightly more difficult to analyze. What the decision to draw this out, in essence, allows you, I suppose what it does is allow you to answer those kind of social network questions quite easily by feeding that information through software, which will tell you who Darwin was corresponding with at particular times. But I think more interestingly, if you look at other information, both here in this kind of keyword section and also in the text of the letter, you might be able to look at, say, by combining the information, the formal information in the header and the more textual information down here, you might be able to start looking not just at the network analysis in terms of who it's corresponding with, but also in terms of, say, ideas as they appear in the text of the letter and how those transferred across networks, the first use of particular terms, the development of particular language and terms across time. Let's go back to my PowerPoint presentation. So the Darwin correspondence is being used in network analysis, but still the most important output is print. So one of the main uses of TEI still is to go from TEI to print, and they still produce a print volume from their TEI every year. There's one of these print volumes here. It's quite thick, as you can see, writes a lot of letters every year. They have a website, so they use the TEI as the basis for a print volume published by Cambridge University Press. They use the same TEI as the basis of their website presentation, which has transcription, searchable transcription of all of the letters, so you can see. And then they feed the same, exactly the same TEI into Epsilon, which is a kind of aggregator, a collaborative digital framework for 19th century letters of science. So what I suppose I'm trying to say is that while the markup, the way TEI is used is kind of project specific, the TEI, in a sense, as a data set, allows you to do many different things with the same data. And if you share your TEI in an open way, it also allows people to take your data and do even more interesting things with it that you haven't heard of or haven't thought of. And again, so Casebooks is another big TEI using project. Casebooks is a record of 80,000 medical consultations. Oh, hang on a minute, there's a typo there. Which make use of horary astrology from the 16th and 17th century. The physical material is bound in 66 volumes, which are held in the Bodleian, and there are over 60,000 people represented in them. And one of the main interests, I suppose, of the project was in these people. So they're interested in the data set really as a way of looking at people in the 16th and 17th century. They were thinking this is a large data set of people, who they were, what they did, and what ailments they suffered from. So again, take you off and show you a TEI record from the project. So again, here you can see at the bottom, there's a transcription of the case itself. But I think the more interesting area of this TEI record is again, the fact that it's recording people. But here they're going further than just recording the person's name. They're also interested in gender, age of the person. And if we come down here, you can see that they also have a kind of slightly more complicated section here, which is encoding what the consultation was about. So the fact that Foreman was the astrologer and the consultant, and that the topic was pregnancy. So they're not just interested in recording the transcription of these cases for display. That's certainly one of the things that they do. They're also interested in it as a data set. So again, there's a kind of, the data's been created for multiple purposes. So in terms of how Casebooks looks, it has its own project website where these cases are presented on an individual basis. So you can look at them case by case. They also, exactly the same TEI is used to present a different version of the Casebooks, which is a reconstruction of how the physical volume looks. So if we go into transcription, so this is exactly the same TEI as a kind of running image by image, transcription by transcription, page by page representation of the Casebooks volumes. And you can see them all there. So a kind of much more physical representation. But also then the same TEI dataset is used to do this rather terrifying thing, which is to create social networks of all of the relations which appear in the dataset. And I deliberately picked this rather terrifying one. This person appears is at the center of a social network. Many of the social networks in there are less impressive, but perhaps of more use. So again, one set of data, three different, very different outputs. And finally, FIHRIST. So FIHRIST is a union catalogue of Islamicate manuscripts in the UK, which is managed by my co-convener Yasmin Faghihi. It contains over 13,000 TEI records from 19 institutions. And FIHRIST, in a sense, is different from the other two projects in that it concentrates more on the descriptive elements of the TEI rather than the transcription, though it does contain some transcriptions. And here's a sample record from FIHRIST. And just very quickly to point out that here you can see that the descriptive part of the record is very long, much longer. It's recording what we think of as the intellectual contents of the manuscript. This is a Quran with all the surahs listed, and also has quite a lot more information both about the physical description and the provenance. And that's because the research interest of this particular project is to take quantitative approaches to the description of manuscripts. Let's check the time. So again, the project has multiple outputs. It has a project website, which in a sense is a catalogue of the holdings, the Islamic manuscript holdings of these 19 institutions. It also, then the same TEI is used again to drive a different display where available of these materials. So where there are images and transcriptions available, same TEI can be fed into a digital library presentation. But also that very same TEI again can be used to take quantitative approaches to the data. So this is a very, very small part of a huge network diagram of the co-occurrence of titles within manuscripts from that data set. The whole thing is massive and rather scary. This is a tiny part of it, but in a sense that this is, again, I mean, this is creating potentially these visualizations of what you might think of as creating new knowledge about this manuscript data set. And then the idea is that what is gleaned from these visualizations, where you can see things which you couldn't really see from reading these 13,000 manuscripts, might be encoded back into the description and form the basis of, again, further research. Okay, so just to tie things up, I just wanted to talk briefly about text encoding initiative and digital humanities in general. So I said at the start, the TEI is a mature standard in digital humanities. There are lots of tools, there's lots of documentation, lots of training to take advantage of. But just because it's a mature tool, it doesn't mean that it's kind of fixed in any sense. The TEI as a community continues to evolve through the participation and contribution of digital humanities scholars. And while TEI, in a sense, is a reflection of the activities which have already been undertaken in TEI, and so, you know, it can be argued in a sense, and it is argued, that it contains some internal biases towards those kind of research. I think the TEI as a community is very welcoming to bringing through different things, not only new areas, but also different perspectives on the areas it already covers. I think in the world of digital humanities and infrastructure, it should be pointed out that TEI, it can be a very low-cost digital humanities solution. Essentially, XML files are just text files, and it doesn't rely on any particular software or infrastructure to create, store, or sustain your data set. And another, I suppose I'm doing, in a sense, what James Cummings did in the article, you know, looking at what people say about what he calls myths about TEI. So TEI is often, particularly, is often disliked by software developers because there's this idea that TEI often, as we've seen, allows more than one way of doing the same thing. So the same letter might be encoded in several different ways. And this can be seen to be a problem in terms of data compatibility. But you know, on the other hand, it does allow for this kind of creative tension between the drive for innovative approaches in digital humanities. So that's doing new things with textual resources and the advantages of doing things the same way. And when those two things come into balance, I think that some very interesting things, some very interesting tensions and conversations emerge in that area. And just from a practical point of view, as somebody who's supported quite a few TEI projects, just leave this up really. The idea that TEI changes the way that researchers do research on textual data. It acts as a repository for approaches and methodologies in textual research. It forms the basis of this community-driven disagreement, collaboration, innovation, textual scholarship, and the idea that it continues to evolve. And then my last slide, and I won't really talk about this because I kind of ran out of time, but I do think there's a sense that TEI, as a mature standard, has had a broader cultural effect on digital humanities in general, in encouraging all sorts of good stuff. And I'll leave that slide there for you to read. So thank you very much for listening, and I shall stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Huw. This is where we would all applaud normally. That's tremendous, and you always remind me in this talk that TEI is so much more than a standard, and it's a community as well. I've had the privilege of going to some events, and I was probably at the same TEI summer school as you. We have some fantastic questions coming in on the chat, and also some answers to them as well, as we're seeing the community help each other, which is lovely. I'm going to pull out a couple of them to get us started. Now, one is around the area of sort of what next. Now, people have heard about TEI. If they want to learn something more about it, apart from obviously coming to your session at the summer school next year, they can't wait until then. First question, are you sharing the slides? And I think the answer in general to that is we're encouraging Canvas for sharing the materials. But the other is where can people go to next to find out more?
Well, I think that to be honest, the best way to engage with TEI is to engage with a project that's already using TEI. I think that the things like the Digital Humanities Summer School, that there is, as it's been around for a while, there are quite a few summer school environments, and I suppose those summer school environments are a way of engaging with people using TEI in a more direct sense or in a more formal sense. But I do think that the TEI community is collaborative and welcoming, and I think that if you find a TEI using project and you contact them, they're very often willing to kind of put you, the main thing with TEI is getting it into context with your research and putting your research into the context of TEI and pointing out some of the possibilities, I think, on a kind of in an informal and conversational way is really the key to engaging with TEI. Because if you try to engage with it immediately as a technical standard, it's too big to sit down and read the guidelines. So I would say the best way of engaging with TEI is through a person. So in this digital age, I would find a person to engage with. And we're happy to be those people for people. So our email addresses will be up. So do get in touch. Thanks
very much. I'm going to put out one other question because it will give us a glimpse into sort of behind the scenes in the TEI community that we've just referred to. How do all editors agree on the meta definitions, such as whether someone would encode something as a title or an honorific, if both of those options exist? And this goes to that point about sometimes there seems to be multiple ways of doing the same thing. But how, in the process of, I suppose, the creation of the standard, but in any particular editorial team or process, how do you make decisions around that?
Well, I think that often there is disagreement, and I think that that's something which can be seen as problematic in TEI. But I also think it's creative, and I think that the main point about TEI really is that no act of encoding is neutral.
Every time great line.
Yeah. Every time you decide to encode something, you're doing it for a purpose. Whether that purpose is implicit and unconscious, or in your reasoning, or whether that is kind of explicit in your project. And I think sometimes some of those discussions which take place around the right way of doing things, even within a project, help to take the subconscious approaches and bring them out into the light where they can be examined as purposes. And the purposes, as I said, are strongly tied to outcomes. So I think having those conversations really helps you to even about trivial things, helps you as a digital humanities scholar to look at your own purposes, and look at what you think are the important things that you're doing with your data, and that somehow that process is important. I think the rule of thumb is if there's no reason to do it differently to other projects, don't do it differently, but you may well have a good reason to do it differently. But you should be clear about that reason.
Thanks, Huw. I even put no active encoding is neutral in the chat so I don't lose it. I think that was we're out of time, but there are quite a few more questions. I found myself still answering the questions from my talk during your talk. I apologise for that. You may find yourself doing the same thing.